Well, good morning everyone, and welcome back, and welcome to our panel, which is Building Alliances, What Relationships Are Needed to Reach the Future We Want. The theme, of course, as we've already heard for day 2, is We Are the Future. So we will have that firmly in our minds over the next hour together. Could I begin then by paying my respects to the Ngunnawal and Ngambri peoples whose traditional lands we're meeting on today, and thank Aunty Matilda House for a beautiful warm welcome to country. I of course need to pay my respects to elders past, present and of course our future emerging generations for whom our collective work over 3 days is so important. I also pay my respects to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples here in the audience today, in particular to June, Carla and Michelle for their amazing work in bringing us together. You might have read in the program, my name's Janine Mohammed. I'm a proud Narungga Kaurna woman from Point Pearce Mission in South Australia. Thank you, Manunga family. I'm a mum of 5 children, 4 of whom are daughters, but would you believe, no grandchildren yet. I'm 50 and I'm not a nana. So if you want to talk to me about your sons over lunch, I'm happy to take any interested parties. That's what it's all about. I'm also the CEO for the WYUT Institute, and of course we're named after our amazing patron, Dr. WYUT O'Donoghue. We are Australia's national Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander community-controlled health research institute. And it's an honour to be invited here today to play my very small part in the work of Wiyi Yani U Thangani. It's such an important, landmark report, and the research and advocacy that's gone behind it for our peoples, especially our women and our girls, including cis, trans women, non-binary and gender diverse mob. As a facilitator of this panel, I've been told it's my job to keep us to time, but I've already talked to my sisters and said we're going to do this collectively. And it's also my job to pose the questions that you want to ask from this amazing panel. So as you're listening, please begin to send through your questions on the digital program app. If you don't know, you can find that app or that mark under the interactive sessions icon. It's also my job and my pleasure to introduce our 3 fabulous panellists who will share their insights and experiences on our topic. They all have extremely illustrious careers and impactful lives, which I don't think I have time to give justice to, so I'll give you the brief versions in a moment, and they'll also have the opportunity to expand on this, but I will refer you to our Summit Handbook for more details on their bios. So, let's begin. This is your life, hey? Senator Dorinda Cox is a Yamatji Noongar woman and a senator for Western Australia. She holds the First Nations science, trade, tourism and resource portfolios for the Greens. Senator Cox has a significant experience in international forums. Kat Henaway was born and raised in Indigenous communities in North Queensland and is a descendant of the Mer and Moa peoples of the Torres Strait Islands. Over the past 30 years, she has gained significant experience in working with multinational companies, government agencies, universities in Sydney, London and Edinburgh. Yeah. Today, Kat is an Indigenous business advisor and learning designer who produced the country's first political leadership incubator for women of colour. My sister Donna Murray is a Wiradjuri and Wunara Nation citizen and currently the CEO at the Indigenous Allied Health Australia. She holds an adjunct associate professorship at UTS and has qualifications and experience in community development, management, Indigenous governance, a mutual passion. So a big warm welcome to each of you and thank you for sharing what I call your wise woman wisdom with us here today. So a little bit about this session. In this session, we want to explore how First Nations women's experiences and knowledges can offer ways of working and interacting differently, and how we can help to inform some constructive approaches to decision making. We also want to think about the need to unite across diverse spaces that span environmental, political, cultural and legal and economic issues and solutions. And that it's time to reinstate our ancient ways and to construct new ways of working to achieve the future we want. So with that in mind, I am going to ask our fabulous speakers to kick off our discussion today and take a few minutes to introduce themselves and their work and how this fits into our theme, which is, as I said, we are the future. And it's almost a three-part question, and to tell us particularly what is the future you envisage and the relationships that we need to have to get there. But before I do, Senator Cox has made a special request that she'd like to take us through a bit of an exercise post-morning tea. So I'll invite you to the podium.
Thank you so much, Janine. And can I first start by acknowledging that we're here on Ngunnawal and Ngambri land. And I had the pleasure of being here the other night at the welcome reception and saw some of you and pay my respects to the elders past and present, and thank Aunty Matilda for welcoming me to country whenever I come here to Ngunnawal and Ngambri lands. Hello and welcome, ladies. What an amazing and very, very overwhelming sight it is to sit down here, and I wanted to get out of my chair for a minute. And anybody that knows what I do in the Senate, I'm always on my feet having a bit of a rant about things. But this time, I want to do something for you because it's wonderful, it's powerful to see inspiring women like you all in one place at this particular moment. Is there anybody in the crowd that's got any accessibility issues where they can't stand? But can I ask all of you ladies to stand, please? Now, if I have your permission, can you please say yes to indulge me for 2 minutes in a brief exercise that I'd like to do with you. Now, I've never done this before, but I'm known as a disruptor, right? So I like to do things a little bit differently. First of all, I want you to close your eyes. To do that, you need to trust me. I want you to imagine yourself back home on your country. I want you to bend down to the ground and pick up a handful of dirt. Now, I want you to rub your hands together and put that dirt right into your hands to feel our mother country and where we come from. Then I want you to clap your hands together really loudly. Whoa, that was like a machine gun. Wow. And I want you to put your hands out in front of you and blow like you're blowing out a birthday cake. Let that breath go. The second thing I want you to do is stamp your feet. At the same time, I want you to shout the words for hello in your mother tongue. Kaya. Today, my sisters, we have awoken the ancestors and we've asked them to collectively join us here today. We have the power to do this. You can sit down now. You can do this wherever you are, whenever you want, and whenever you need to feel spirit to support you. Whenever we are afraid and whenever we are lonely, they are here to walk with us. So I thank you for indulging me for that 90 seconds. Janine, do you want me to go first?
Sure. While you've got the podium, let's do it.
All right. As part of this panel, I've been asked to share my vision with you for 2043. At that time, I will be 67 years old. I'll be retired from my current job, I hope, as a senator. Safest words ever. I hope that my children, who will be 31 and 29, will have carved out their careers and are thinking about giving me grandchildren, just like Janine. And I won't be too old to enjoy this, and I want to have some beautiful memories of the last 2 decades, inside but also outside of politics, and the social movement that I think we are on the brink of creating this year. Alliances are at the heart of the work that I do every day, and my hope for the future is that we begin to see the fruits of our labour in 2043. I hope that our next generation will be able to be thriving instead of just being in survival mode. That ongoing issue of colonialism is now a thing that's fixed in the past. And the truth-telling that we all seek in our country to have a truly reconciled, create a new partnership in the interests of the oldest living culture in this world is ours, and it's in the palm of our hands. As a senator, I sit on the crossbench, which means I have a very special role in creating some of those alliances and building across the parliament, and particularly in the Senate. And I want to acknowledge Rachel Siewert, who's in the crowd, who's my predecessor. Rach, give everyone a wave. There she is, at the front there. Who's also here. Rachel did an amazing thing 2 years ago, and she stepped aside to let a black woman through. And you're a great alliance for me, Rach. Thank you. Now, in the Senate, we've got 3 jobs. 3 jobs only, on most days, and they're to inquire, debate and legislate. And in those jobs, I sit alongside people in my inquiry work that are far removed from my own values, from that of my party. So I can debate with respect, I make a rule to take no low blows, and I don't make it personal. I debate the issue and not the person, and I legislate with the future in mind of all my constituents, because I come from the state of Western Australia, the whole of the Western Seaboard, and I didn't get 16% of the vote on the ticket in WA just by my mob electing me. So alliances keep it real for me, they keep it grounded, but I am first and foremost a Yamatji Noongar woman, a First Nations woman. What that presents for me is a real challenge, because I also have First Nations portfolio, the resources portfolio. I think Adam Bant is a bloody genius because he put a black woman in front of mining in this country. How do you think that goes down with some of the gas companies? In fighting for our country, fighting for our water every single day. I also have just inherited sport last week, so I'm now the sports spokesperson. I hold 6 portfolios: tourism, trade and also science, that I'm still minding and hope to get rid of. But that means I have 6 portfolios in my party room. I hold the most. So I think that the boss thinks I'm a safe pair of hands when it comes to managing some of the business. But the double-edged sword for me is a First Nations woman, constantly in the media, constantly under attack. And unfortunately, some of that attack is from our own people. The lateral violence I experience is real. But I don't want that to be part of my future. I want us to find the sweet spot to all work together. I hope that in 2043 we will have a treaty in this country, a treaty that will bring us to a decolonised space of some of our systems, particularly on climate change. And I know the wonderful Janine Mohammed was at the UN a few weeks ago talking about decolonisation and climate change and how important it is, because we know what it takes to look after country. We've been doing it for 65,000 years. But in 2043, we're going to have to adapt considerably if we don't do the work now. Now, in closing, I just want to say there's no better time for the reckoning of our shared history that's happening in our country now, right now. And we need to look at building those alliances across the spectrum. We can heal, we can move forward, and we need as many people on this journey as we can get. And remembering the ritual that we all just did just then, by bringing our old people with us collectively, as they've paved the way, we are standing on their shoulders and we are making that movement forward. And those in the present, and when we look in the eyes of our children and know that we must and we can do better, that our grandchildren, our great-grandchildren, the next 5 generations of our children deserve a better life, one that is full of peace, love, light, and most of all, justice. Thank you, my sisters.
Good morning, everyone. I'd also like to acknowledge the beautiful Ngunnawal and Ngambri country that we are on here today. My name is Kat Henaway, and as Janine said, I was born and raised in Torres Strait Islander communities in Cairns, North Queensland. I had the great privilege of being raised by my ate and aka, my grandparents, and my ate was an owner of a pearl diving business his entire life. So he was a very, very successful entrepreneur. So it's no surprise at all that I ended up in entrepreneurialism myself. In my early career, I had moved away from North Queensland when I was in my early 20s. I ended up in Sydney, and I was working for about 8 years in multinational organisations in Sydney. And I have to say, I had a really great experience. Back then, you didn't really have to tick a box when you applied for a job. We just went into work, got jobs, and worked with every other Australian in institutions. I had some really wonderful experiences, and then I decided to go and live in the UK. So I lived and worked in the UK for about 8 years in London, Edinburgh, and I also settled in Brighton, which is an hour south of London. And in that experience, I had also been working for large multinational firms there in finance and legal firms. And I used that opportunity to travel the world. I wanted to explore and see where my father came from. He's German, grew up in Berlin. So I wanted to travel around Europe and see as much of the world as I could. And halfway through that experience, I did a NEIS course. I was back in Australia for a short time, and I did the New Enterprise Incentive Scheme program here, and some of you will know of it. It's a really fantastic small business course. And then I went back to the UK and I started writing applications to purchase businesses in the UK. So we looked at restaurants and hotels and all kinds of things, and came very, very close to buying a hotel in Brighton just before the GFC arrived. So thankfully we didn't go down that path. So around 2008, I decided to come back to Australia, and with all of that experience of working internationally and learning how to write business plans and set up businesses, I came back to Australia and did a community management degree at Macquarie University. And shortly after that, I went to the School of Social Entrepreneurs to learn the process of establishing social enterprises. And I started my first little company. It was called Blackademics. And I wanted to create a website that would help Indigenous people coming to universities to know where to access all of the resources that you needed. So that was my first little enterprise. And then from then on, I started working in leadership development. And that's where I met the lovely Carol Vale, who is my wonderful sister up here. She runs Murrowan. Carol and I were working at the Australian Graduate School of Management, developing career leadership programs for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander executives and employees. And it was in that experience that I really began to understand the incredible lack of career leadership programs for our people. And some of the research we saw at the time, this was about 2017, was that Indigenous people knew that career development was a thing, but only about 16% of us felt that it was accessible to us. And when I saw that statistic, I thought, well, this is a shame, because all corporations, all institutions have big budgets to develop everybody's career, and how come there's so little for us? And so Carol and I launched some very groundbreaking programs at AGSM. Carol did the Aboriginal Career Leadership Development Program for the New South Wales Public Service. I developed the Emerging Indigenous Executive Leadership Program in collaboration with Reconciliation Australia. And together we started to build this ecosystem where Indigenous people could access career leadership development. So a couple of years after doing that work, I decided I wanted to consult, follow in my sister's footsteps, and I went out consulting, and I now do this work independently in my own business, and I work with organisations to help them develop very similar programs. And throughout this experience, I ended up on the board of Women for Election Australia. And they knew I had been writing these types of programs, and they asked me to write a program to help more Indigenous women come into their political candidate training workshops. And initially I said no, because I found that every time I wrote these types of programs, you know, a lot of non-Indigenous people would get their fingers into it and sort of elbow me out. And I thought, no, I'm not going through that experience again. Anyway, after 6 months, I relented and I wrote a program called Politics in Colour. And our very first event was a webinar with 4 women of colour politicians who specifically wanted to talk about what it's like to be a woman of colour in politics in this country. And although I had a very comprehensive program, I couldn't find any woman of colour politician that wanted to talk about something else on the agenda. They all wanted to talk about their experience of being a woman of colour in politics. So we went with it. And needless to say, that webinar attracted over 100 women from 3 countries. We featured Linda Burney, Moraine Faruqi, Jenny Leong and Kausalya Vaghela. And they all spoke about what it was like, what their journey was like. And so that launched Politics in Colour, and since then we've been running the country's first political leadership incubator for women of colour. And we've heard from some amazing Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander women across the country, including the lovely Dorinda Cox, about their stories and how they got into politics. And it's been an incredibly inspiring journey, and I know that we'll talk a little bit later about how to build partnerships and alliances along that journey, but I'll just leave it there for now. But thank you.
Thanks, ladies. Just quickly, Donna Murray, Wiradjuri, Wonnarua, woman of New South Wales, and I'd like to acknowledge the Ngunnawal and Ngambri peoples of the beautiful ACT and surrounding region who have supported me to live and work on their lands for the past 20 years. I'd also like to pay my respects to my Wiradjuri and Wonnarua elders, who are, some of them are here today, and pay my respects particularly to Aunty Cheryl Penrith, who has been an inspiration in my life for a very long time, along with a lot of our other elders. Just a little bit about me, like a lot of you. I'm obviously a daughter, a mum, a nana, an aunt, and play a lot of roles in our lives. And I'm here as the CEO of Indigenous Allied Health Australia. And in our organisation is an Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander community controlled organisation with over 1,600 members who own our company, and they are our community and our family. And our IHA family is very important to one, supporting aspirations, dreams and goals of people moving into the allied health workforce, but also supporting the dreams and aspirations and priorities of our communities and our organisations in developing and supporting a workforce of our own design to meet our own needs and our own priorities across the health sector. One of my passions is also involved in Wiradjuri and Wonnarua Indigenous nation building and our self-governance and our political governance, and asserting our rights as Wiradjuri citizens and Wonnarua citizens, and the alliances that we build together as a collective nation to mobilise our citizens to drive our self-determination and set our priorities for the future. And for 2043, I'll highly likely be a great-grandmother. And listening to the panel yesterday for the young people and saying when to know to stand up and stand aside and let others, encourage them to stand up, that's definitely where I will be in 2043. And I think our future is in good hands. But in order to ensure our 65,000 years of knowledges, practices, sharing and relationships continues to get stronger, for our young people, is our importance of our nation identity and our collective identity and the things that we share, the commonalities as First Nations women and nations, but also our specifics of law and language and culture that we hold dear, and getting back to what's important for us in setting our own priorities. And being able to build those mutual alliances with each other, internations, which we've done in some of the space, and learning and sharing is really important. But I think that will then help shape what type of ancestor will I be in 20, 50 and 100 years, when my 7 generations look back and say, you know, what did my great-great-granny do? I want to know that I've done enough, I've tried my best and showed leadership, and with culture at heart and my cultural values guiding the way with integrity. And so I believe, you know, designing a future of our own in 2043 will be well on its way. And I think our young people here have really shown that's in really good hands.
Thank you, Donna, and I do believe it's in very, very good hands, especially with you women as our leaders and role models in the space. I'm going to ask a really quick question, but I'm going to come back to nation building, and Senator, I'm going to come back to that sweet spot. I have watched Parliament, and I think it'll be hard to get a sweet spot in there. So in terms, at WYUT Institute, right, we have a lot of people come to us and ask us to be their black tick box, impart our knowledges where, you know, they come in, we think we're on a good thing and we're going to have some mutual benefits that happen, but that doesn't eventuate. And I think one of the most frustrating things is us educating whoever we're having alliances with. So for us, one of our core values, I think, is maturity of the other organisation. You know, as a person who's dedicated my life to cultural safety, I'm not going to be there educating someone about white privilege or about racism or what cultural safety is. So my question to you guys, what are the fundamentals, or what are those fundamental ingredients for you that you look at when you're thinking about alliances? How do you decide if you're going to align with someone and do some work with them?
That maturity and readiness is really important when we're looking at mutual alliances with mainstream or others. And I think, you know, people can say they're genuine and they can use words, but it really comes down to action with an alliance with mainstream. Cultural safety, responsiveness, but listening to the priorities of First Nations women or our organisations is critical. Not coming to the table with an already planned agenda. So having integrity, maturity, readiness, commitment to listen, but deep listening, and being ready to do things our way, I think is something really important to me. So, you know, breaking down those systemic settler colonial systems and being willing to open up to something different that we know will work as it's worked for 65,000 years. I think they're some of the key things. There's many more, but I'll hand it over to my colleagues.
Senator? Yeah? Okay.
One of the things that I really appreciated about one of my partners, which is Women in Leadership Australia, I think the real difference with my alliance with that organisation that I've seen is that I was dealing with the decision maker at the very top of the organisation. So I was now influencing the people that can make change, that can affect change. I was working with a woman called Susie Finkelstein, and Susie, whatever advice I gave to her, she didn't have to ask the organisation for permission. She could make a decision as the head of the organisation to implement that strategy. And so that meant that cultural safety, cultural awareness, cultural diversity happened very, very quickly in that organisation. So that was really a big learning for me, because in the past when I've tried to influence change in organisations, I've worked with people at much lower levels, and when they're in lower levels they might be very enthusiastic for change, and they might be really happy for your advice, but they're not able to implement it.
Yeah, and it's a hard thing to do, hey, to sort of say, no, I'm not going to talk to your director.
Yeah.
I want to talk to your CEO. It doesn't come naturally, I don't think. It ever has to me.
Yeah.
But I think knowing that I'm making a change for mob, I take that power with me and I say, no, I deserve, on behalf of my mob, to speak to the CEO.
Let me speak to the boss.
Hey.
I think for me, some of the really critical points, and I'm just going to keep it real for a minute, that if you step into my office in the Senate wing and you come in and you start running people down, right? Like the trust factor is real, right? I get a lot of people who come in and say, oh, my organisation wanted to work with this community or with this group, and they start running them down. And I think to myself, I'm out. There's no way that I'm going to build an alliance with anybody that comes with a yarn that's attached in a negative way about mob, and that we have to honour that.
Yeah.
Because if you don't have your own people's back in that, and we engage in that type of, as I said in my opening speech, lateral violence against each other, we're never going to get anywhere. We're never going to move forward. On a personal level, the way that I weed out whether I'm going to work with someone individually in the Senate. Now, I've sat next to people like Malcolm Roberts from One Nation, you all look, and Malcolm and I can have a conversation about cheese and chocolate. But we can't talk politics, right, because we don't agree. The person on the other side of me when I sent estimates, Holly Hughes. Now, Holly Hughes has been made famous by my former colleague, Senator Thorpe, and there's differences in that. But you find a mutual sweet spot and you can find a real testing ground with people in building alliances, and this is how I found works best for me, is to find what that looks like and start wheeling people in the direction of what is that sweet spot, what are your values, will you honour and be committed to and see things through, because we always find people who say, oh, I'm going to get into a conversation or a partnership or an alliance with someone, and then they back out halfway through because people start to see others' true colours in that. Now, there's a lot of things I will not do with the Liberal Party and those on some of the parts of the crossbench in an alliance, but you have to think about your own values in that and what you're putting out to the world, what you're willing to not work on. Now, ladies, in my experience, we've all got trauma. Every one of us come in some way or form with our own trauma. The last thing we want to do is project that onto somebody else when we're trying to build a partnership and build an alliance. And I've seen this time and time again. And so it's a real message for us to make sure that we are looking after ourselves, we're doing our work, but also that we're making sure those fellas over there do theirs, and call them out for it and move away from them if you have to. No one says that you always have to say yes, and the most power you have is always to say no. Okay?
Let your yeses be yeses and your noes be noes. And I think you'll all agree, I think the other thing that we have as Aboriginal women in particular is that feeling in your stomach, hey? Brim Mob will call it, Leon, my Leon doesn't feel good about this. And we have years of experience that we bring into that room, and I think we can size someone up in 5 seconds flat. Minister Burney said this morning that stories are really important, and they're our greatest asset, So can I ask you to tell us a story, and it might be about cheese and chocolate, about an unlikely alliance. What was the journey and what was the outcome? Thanks.
I thought about this last night. This was hard because sometimes, you align yourself with good people that you want to work with, and sometimes there's these juicy little ones that just come by surprise, and you come with your own assumptions and perceptions to that, and then it turns out to be something different. So I was debating about what type of example, but a strengths-based one I thought I'd share in the international First Nations space, and where First Nations women are really driving that collaboration, sharing and best practice. And it is in the health sector, but it's also in the nation building work, because a lot of our First Nations women are driving our own nation business and our own self-government drive to voice treaty and truth, And so in the international space, it was really unlikely that we'd get something formal with Indigenous Allied Health driving it, with First Nations Health Authority in Canada, and an organisation in Hawaii, and our brothers and sisters across the ditch there in Aotearoa. And what we got was the power of strength together. Like, it was really surprising of sharing our solutions, but also learning. And, you know, we thought we were behind, can I say, in health workforce development, when we're actually leading a lot of the work internationally. And so that was really surprising for us. And then that our other First Nations colleagues wanted to pick up the work we were doing. So we have a multitude of programs working with young people in education, training, in employment. We have a range of programs with university students around that interprofessional practice, self-awareness. How do we work together collectively, but how do we keep our identity in our profession? Because often that's really difficult coming, you know, out of white institutions. And so some of that work we've been leading, there was an unlikely alliance where they've picked up our programs and sort of made them their own in their own space. But in saying that and following up with those, it's really interesting now, well, how can we benefit from what they've learnt from similar experiences? In a mainstream perspective, there's a medical equipment company that came to IHA and wanted to work with us, and we were really saying, why? You know, that's not our space. But it came back to they're wanting to learn around relationships, around our ways of working, how to better partner and collaborate with First Nations peoples, and they were interested in the training and education that we provided. But that took 2 years of building trust, of sussing each other out, and about, is there a mutual benefit and alliance here that keeps our integrity at play, but also are they willing to innovate and do things the way we know our communities want things done. And so in the end, we have done a partnership with an international and with our mainstream partner, and that has had mutual benefits, can I say, learning, sharing, but also their investment in First Nations health workforce, in our communities. So during COVID, we rang them and said, we need this equipment for Western New South Wales. They said, yep, we'll get it. And calling on those partners to benefit our own communities is really important, but keeping integrity, trust, and cultural safety at heart. But their willingness, and they've made a commitment, and now they've acted. So the action is also part of that partnership. So it has been successful, but it did take time to go through those values, align what it is those principles of working are, but it had to be on our terms. And that was probably the critical point.
Yeah, time's so important, isn't it, and trust. Kat?
Yeah, I agree with that. Setting the bar high and saying, no, you know, we will deliver what you need, but let us lead. The example the story I'm going to tell is about my relationship with an organisation called Women for Election Australia. As I said before, I was on their board, and they asked me to write a program, and that's where Politics in Colour came from. And shortly after I wrote the program, they were very, very excited, predominantly white women board. But I felt very uncomfortable staying on the board. So I left, and there was another Indian woman. There's only 2 of us, women of colour, on the board. And she said, trademark the name and let's get out of here. And so we did. And I said to the board, we're taking Politics in Colour out because we can run this in a culturally safe way. You're white women, we can't guarantee cultural safety if we leave it in your hands. And so that's what we did. They understood that. And it was a little bit uncomfortable for, a few months there with us, coaching them about cultural safety and where they went wrong. But we maintained the relationship with Women for Election. And in our first couple of years, every lead we got that translated into purchasing one of our events or workshops or sponsorship, they all came from Women for Election. So I was really glad that we were able to maintain that relationship because they were really integral in our growth, in our organisational development. And they introduced us to some amazing partners like Pathways to Politics for Women. We have an incredible partnership with them. They've introduced us to a global think tank called Apolitical Foundation, and we have a lot to do with them. So maintaining the relationships with the predominantly white-led organisations that you might have fallen out with or that you may leave or disagree with, being able to sort of nurture that relationship and maintain it was a really, really good lesson for me. I've walked away from many organisations and just closed the door, but with this one I made a decision to maintain the relationship. And three years down the line, we worked together in a consortium and we won a $5 million federal government grant to deliver political candidate training for women of colour. Me particularly, I do the women of colour part, across the country over the next 4 years. So we are going to... So maintaining that relationship again with Women for Election has resulted in them now absolutely empowering me and my little company to go across the entire country and really ramp up this pipeline of amazing First Nations and women of colour into politics.
So you exercised your power, and at the end of it got an amazing result. Thanks, Kat.
I think for me, as I mentioned, some of those unlikely conversations about rapport building and about developing those relationships and maintaining them, more importantly. When I'm in the Senate, people go, "Great jacket, I like your shoes, where did you get those from?" And it's the most unlikely people, right, who will ask those sorts of questions or make those sorts of comments to you. But I know they're doing it to reach out and maintain some of those relationships, because in the Senate it's quite unique where we are a little bit swords down. We try and work together quite effectively. We're on joint select committees together, we're on Senate committees together. So we are forced almost into a framework to work together, which can be a little bit confrontational when you're a crossbencher from a minor party and you're the only person in the room. You don't have the numbers. And so you've got to work the room a little bit and develop some of those relationships to make stuff happen and to feel supported and feel confident enough to be able to put your point forward. One of the most unlikely alliances, and like Donna, I was thinking about this last night thinking, that's a bit daunting. And then this morning I had to front up to Duntroon, the Royal Military College here in Canberra, because I'm going on the Australian Defence Force a parliamentary program next week in Darwin, and I asked some Senate estimates questions at the last round around the floods in the Kimberley. Now, I saw my Kimberley sisters here and young people. Big shout out to them. Oh, there they are at the back there, waving and shouting, who were affected by floods this year. And so I asked lots of questions about the ADF being deployed into First Nations communities. What does that look like? Where's your cultural training? Have you got a cultural policy? And they were like, no, Senator, we don't. And so for me, that was a real trigger point to say, well, actually, I have to get on the inside to see how they are preparing themselves to go into our communities and to actually experience that in a way where I could provide that direct advice to the people on the ground, the engineers and others who are going to be deployed into our communities to work with our people. So you've got to get out of your comfort zone a little bit. And the unlikely alliance for me is I'm going to have to make some friends in defence next week, to make sure that I'm fed and looked after, to also get an outcome for mob in a policy way and legislation if it requires, but more so to stand up, because until we get a voice in Parliament, we are going to be the lone voice, the 11 voices you've got sitting up in there at the moment. And this is the reason why I'm advocating so strongly, and our party room is supporting Voice to Parliament, is because we want to be across all that. It's not just, some of the issues that are continually the ones that are so difficult for government to commit to. We also want to know about the RBA rate. We want to know about the Defence Force and what they're going to do, and where they're going to dump high-grade nuclear waste on our country. Of course we do. We want to ask some of those questions. It matters to us because it harms our country and our people, and so it will affect us in the future. So my unlikely alliance and putting myself into that is something that I really encourage other people to do, is to look at those places where no one else may have gone to before, some of those relationships, and ask the question. Be brave, be courageous, and ask those questions about what's happening here, if it affects you or it affects our mob. And I think that's a really important, particularly our women and our girls. There's an important tenor in that around, people being deployed or flying in and out of our communities, particularly our remote communities. So it's about safety too. So I'm going to be eyes and ears next week looking at some of that stuff so that I can provide advice to the federal government to say this is what needs to be fixed. But my maintaining of those relationships is with the Assistant Minister. I've already chatted to Matt Keogh, and he's already said, don't worry, Dorinda, we'll look after you while you're up there. And it's the maintenance of those relationships. I catch the plane with him when I'm coming to Parliament, so I go and have a yarn. We might not be part of the same party, but we also are mums and dads and politicians that have some like values in the work that we do.
Yeah, got your back. Thank you. Now, I said I would come back to it. Donna, can you tell us a little bit about your work in nation building and how it pertains to our political determinants and also our cultural determinants?
So when we say nation building, it is a concept that's been a research project for over 30 years that was driven by Harvard University and a team of economists, really. Yeah. And researchers, but we're saying, and then you sort of say, well, what does that got to do with us here? So over that research, working with First Nations in North America, they did a whole range of work of why does one nation excel over another that doesn't, and maybe nation B has more resources, they might have an economic development base like some of our native title bodies, but they're not successful with sustainable development for our own mob on the ground. And so some of those lessons we've brought to Australia is really, in essence, it's the leadership and the collectiveness of the nation to work together, to have a political governance or a cultural governance model of making decisions. And I know a lot of the First Nations women here are in communities and nations that have their own nation decision-making bodies, but a lot like Wiradjuri currently don't. Mm-hmm. And so we want truth, treaty and voice. If it comes to treaty, who do we have treaty with? Mm-hmm. And is that with our nation groups? And if it is, well, what is our own self-government, like Wiradjuri government, that's going to negotiate that treaty? Mm-hmm. And have our own political views, priorities and solutions at the table for a government-to-government relationship. So do you see that might change the dynamics of government coming in and telling us what we want and how we're going to get it in a 3-year funding cycle, opposed to a nation of driven by First Nations women, because can I say in the Wiradjuri nation building space, we do have our men, and our men that have now passed have provided us the instructions to move forward, and our Wiradjuri women have been mobilised to really lead this work, and Auntie Cheryl is one of those. and about how do we organise ourselves based on our law, our language, our practices of who we are, and then how do we start acting as a collective nation to make decisions, set priorities, hear our young people, hear our women, what is it and how are we designing the future that we desire, and then leading that and being solid with self, you know, backing ourselves and having the strength of empowering our mob to stay together. And sometimes we have to deal with lateral violence, we have to deal with trauma, we have to be very self-aware, but trauma not of self and family, but also trauma of our communities. And how do we use this approach to help heal? And I know for Wiradjuri and the reclamation of our language and the program that Uncle Stan Grant has led for many years, over 25 years, he didn't ask for permission, he just did it. And we didn't ask for permission to make sure that we're preserving that reclamation, we're just doing it. And 25 years down the track, we have our own language course. It involves nation building, community development practice. It's how do we mobilise and build our own networks? How do we have relationships with other nation groups living on our own country? Because Wiradjuri has a lot of resettlement. And how do we design something that works for us? Then we can actively participate in a bigger national process. And so it's our own political movement using our culture, language and law at the centre of what we do. And it doesn't mean using a corporate governance structure like ORIC or ASIC to drive our business. No. Because that is under a white legislative law. It is our own law that we need to act. And that's, in essence, where we're taking nation building.
Thank you, Donna. It's getting our house in order, hey, before we go out. Senator Cox, we're going to turn over to the audience, but there was a question up there before that I think would be great for you to answer. You're a member of Parliament. There's only 11 Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander members of Parliament. You're from a minor party, yeah? How do you actually build alliances, particularly with the non-Indigenous parliamentarians, in that space? How do you do the? If you had one gem of knowledge to impart on us, what would that be?
Can I say, being part of what is the third largest party now in the Parliament, the Australian Greens party, but it's hard to get cut through. We hold the balance of power in the Senate and plus 2 votes. So we do a lot of work in zigzagging across the Parliament and finding those like-minded people or like-minded issues that we want to vote on with those people. Now, we've got to be careful, obviously, that we don't want to be seen sitting with people who we know will not clearly represent our people. So in my party room, getting my voice heard and making sure that as a First Nations woman, I'm able to get across all of the spectrum of the portfolios that my party room holds. I've given responsibility, so I've had conversations with my own team to say, if you hold the portfolio of health, you also hold the portfolio of First Nations health, and it's your responsibility. Because I can't carry that burden. I can't carry the emotional burden that it takes for me to get letter and email and complaint, Facebook message, time after time. And we are a minority party and we are not in government. We don't have any resources to give people. So that's heartbreaking, but we have power in the way that we vote, relationships that we build, and legislation that we can bring on and conversations we can have to influence. So they're the things that I use. One of the things that I've learnt very, very quickly in Parliament is that it's not always about the loudest voice. If you're the loudest voice, sometimes your message gets lost. And people have said that to me in the speeches that I've delivered. And sometimes you need to show a bit of passion, you need to show a bit of anger, right? Like, because we are angry. We're angry because we're still sitting here having the same yarn our old people were having. And that angers us. It frustrates us. And so there's times when you've got to raise your voice and you've got to slam your fist and you've got to do the things that are going to get people's attention, because otherwise it's just run of the mill, particularly in the parliament. So my one gem is to know the times to do that, is to know when it's time for you to turn up the pressure, to put the pressure on to other people to do the things that you need to get the result that you want. So that's my gem, Janine.
Yeah, pick and choose your battles, hey? We only got so much energy.
I think your positioning is really important in all of this.
Yeah. Kat, you've worked for multinationals, internationals. You would have come across a lot of non-Indigenous people. How have you brought them along on the journey?
I think because I was born and raised in Indigenous communities, there's something that is very grounding in that. Obviously, our ancestral ties to culture, and that really fortifies your sense of knowing and who you are and where you come from. And so when I work for non-Indigenous organisations, or in the past, or when I collaborate with white organisations now, that knowing and that grounding in my culture, it enables me to never apologise for who I am and never apologise for where I've come from or what's happening in Indigenous communities. And so I also often don't lower the bar. And this is what gets me into trouble with white organisations. And it sometimes causes conflict that we have to negotiate, but I won't lower the bar, because I know what our people have achieved. I know what my ancestors and my ate and aka have achieved in Cairns for our huge communities up there. I know how incredibly smart and talented and wonderfully gracious people we've come from and I've grown up with. And so I won't let non-Indigenous people paint a picture that we need help. It's the other way around. They need our help. They need our advice on how to be better people, on how to reform this country, on how to heal this country. And they won't be able to do it without us. So it's a lesson that I've carried with me always. I won't let people diminish who we are.
Yeah. I wish I had $1 for every time I've heard the problem with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, as opposed to, putting the focus back on the systems that have caused us such harm, and also being asked to leave your blackness at the door. And the minute you start to talk about black issues, that roll of the eyes, And that brings us to our next question from the audience, which is, how do you work with an alliance that at its core does not align with the values of mob, uses that deficit discourse, the deficit model, but you are bound to this alliance due to funding, legislation and accreditation?
Yeah, this seems to be my everyday.
I kind of wondered whether this came from a health professional, Donna.
Being involved in allied health and the sector more broadly, there's a lot of alliances that we do have to be involved in. Well, we don't have to be, but it's nice to be at the table to be the agitator. And if they don't hear from somebody else with a different lens and a different opinion, you're always going to get the standard way, right? And so this is where I get confused all the time by my assertiveness and stand and passion as the aggressive black woman. But that's okay, because part of our role, I guess, in this leadership space is to educate. but it will also provide a different way forward and use the things that we know. As you're saying, learn from us. They need to learn from us how to be better people sometimes. And the love that Northern and that connectedness that we have doesn't exist in that mainstream alliance space. So it's really difficult. And sometimes I talk at these alliances and it's like I'm talking a different language, and Janine will know what I mean. And then I have to check to say, I have to find safe words for you mob, not for me, for you mob, when I'm trying to explain racism and the discrimination that's actually happening right now in this room, to call them out.
The fragility.
It is, their fragility. And so funding and legislation, the funding bodies have to understand the cultural load that this brings to us as First Nations women, being in these really unsafe spaces. They also have to understand that legislation is made for mainstream and really not for us to thrive and our self-determination. But again, resistance is really important. And it's how do we find different ways to say many things to different people and build those alliances within that mainstream space that can then be your supporter. Or they say the same thing and guess what? It's a great idea because somebody else has said it. And so, you know, that strategic approach to get those messages across in that space that's really unsafe for you is really important. And there will be one or two that you can really bring with you along, you know, and gee them up to say some things that need to be said as well.
And there's safety in numbers too, HCS.
Absolutely.
Like the amount of times that I'm sitting there and I'm getting frustrated and biting my lip, and you know, if I only had a sister next to me that we could just look at each other knowingly, you know, like, oh, here we go.
Yeah.
Senator.
I think for me, you know, I'm in an environment group or party, and some of the environment groups and mob that are fighting for country often come back to me and say, we can't work in their way, because they try and tell us what to do. We've been caring for this country for a long time. And when we talk about how to care for country and land management practices, and if you look across the country, the government has bound us up into co-management agreements with our mob. And it's like, what are you trying to teach us? We've been here longer than you. And so the frustration of some of those alliances when people go into those arrangements and have some of those conversations is, where is First Nations knowledges, practices and customs in all of that? And so as the science portfolio holder, I have constant conversations with all of the science academies and peak organisations around First Nations knowledges in science at the heart of what you do. Stop adding it on. It's not a side dish, it's the main meal. And you start from that starting place.
Yeah.
But it's hard work. It is hard work. And the endurance of that as us as women, like, I don't know how many people don't know this, but under the Native Title Act, we lost our rights to water. You know, we got our land rights, but we lost our rights to water. And that's the most important thing for our birthing places, our water, sanitation of that, sea country, what it provides for some of our saltwater mob. You know, this is important yarn now that we need reform in to decolonise that space, to bring it back to the centre of what it means for us in our cultural knowledges and what Donna just talked about, the importance of that nation building. But we need to do that collectively, because it can't just be one voice.
It's a matter of valuing us, Sis. Kat?
I think I have the luxury of just leaving because I run my own business, and if things don't feel right, I'm going to feel it in my body. I usually feel it in my chest first, and when I feel that heaviness, I know if I don't get out of here, I'm going to entangle myself into something that's going to make me sick. So as soon as my body tells me this is not a healthy place for me to be, you know, the values are not aligned in the way I originally thought they were. I made assumptions that I now realise I probably shouldn't have. This arrangement is not working. And so when I feel that in my chest, I'm that's usually the time that I know that I have to make a tough decision and tell the organisation I'm going to exit. And I've done that recently. And it's actually very empowering. Often in the past when I was younger, I would stick around and feel obligated to stay in these environments, but not at this age, I don't.
Yeah, no. It's a matter of health and well-being, isn't it? Like there's a voice in my head that says, run now. So morning tea, I'm gone.
I was just going to say, I think the alliances that you do have to make decisions about what are you going to be involved in and what are you not going to be involved in. And I think, we're collective, so we think about what is the impact for Aboriginal, our own mob on the ground. But it's about making these non-Indigenous and mainstream providers accountable to providing what they're funded and or supposedly doing for all Australians, which includes us as First Nations. And, governments aren't calling them to account. And their other mainstream colleagues aren't calling them into account. So we have to. What are you doing for our First Nations women? What are you doing for our young girls? What are you doing for our mob out there in our communities? Because whatever it is, it's non-existent.
Yep.
So I think that's important too for your own self-care.
Now, with your permission, I'm going to ask one last question. We've got 3 minutes on the clock. How do we ensure decision makers, people high up in government, departments and CEOs, think about, and in brackets, without someone having to tell them, the impacts their decisions have on Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people? So how do we ensure?
Can I start by saying we need to get more First Nations women elected all across this country. There are over 5,000 councillors, and there's plenty of room for beautiful Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander women to connect with their councils, run for office, cut your teeth on politics in your local community. And that's where you're going to start to see change occurring. You can have an immediate impact at local government level. So a lot of people aren't aware of this, but there are over 200 Indigenous councillors in this country, and we don't celebrate that. We don't know that. Most of us don't know that. There are 14 Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander mayors in Queensland alone. So, we are powerful people. We are super intelligent. We've cared for this country for 65,000 years. We know what we're doing. We've just been oppressed for 200 years and told that we don't have any idea. We have every idea. Because I'm really passionate about more Indigenous women in politics, I think if you really want to make a change, if you really want to see decision-making change in this country, get into politics. I originally thought that change would come through industry, through organisations, through corporates, aligning with corporates. And then I did this leadership program and I completely flipped the switch and I said, no, it's going to come from the top. Politics is the highest level of leadership you can enjoy and experience in this country. And, Dorinda is a testament of how effective and how much change you can, how much impact you can have in a short space of time. I think we all need to be in charge of this country.
This is the ever-ending question, isn't it? And settler colonial government institution in itself. This is, our decision makers. It's short-term thinking. It's not strategic, and it's like band-aids. So the impact on our people will continue. We need them to be long-term strategic thinkers. We need governments, like Dorinda here, people in there saying this is not about terms, this is about the lives of people. And think about our generational thinking, make decisions on generational thinking. In the good faith in your leadership as a government official or a CEO that you've embedded those ways of working in your organisation so it's sustainable decision making. But this is really hard, and we've got to keep resisting, I think.
I think one of the easiest things, and I want to go back to a point Donna made earlier, is about organising. Community organising and grassroots organising is the easiest way to get cut through, because they're democratically elected leaders, right? And the bureaucrats that occupy that space have to go under that ministerial responsibility and talk to the minister at some point about the decision that they think they've made in the senior bureaucracy, particularly in governments. And grassroots organising is shaping, and Nova Peris is in the room here somewhere, is she? Where's sister?
There she is up there.
She is. Nova's just done a wonderful petition about racism in the AFL, grassroots organising. And look at the impact. It's forced the AFL to now ban racists from AFL games. They're now looking, changing the policy. This is the power that we can wield, and the power of the media. Because I tell you, every morning at 7 a.m, my chief of staff sit in the front row, lands me a media summary, so I know what's going on in the world. Before I even get out of bed, I'm reading that because I need to know and get my head around it. The media controls everything in this country, and if we can get mob to be powerful, big shout out to Tangiora, where are you? Nada Media, mob from at the front there, Pilbara mob, who do some great work in profiling what's happening in our communities. This gets the attention of governments. All of a sudden, it's a hotbed, and they all want to be there. They all want to be up in the space, getting their face on the news, talking about the issues, talking to mob. So we have to keep doing grassroots organising. We have to make sure that those decision makers and those politicians, it's not just a cutting of the ribbon moment, or coming out because there's an issue in our communities because of the youth crime. We have to get them to be coming all the time. And the way we control that is to say, we need you here and we need you now, and we be in control of that. That is true self-determination in what we're going to get in this country when we start absolutely building our nations, as Donna was talking about before.
It's a people movement. We are the only thing left standing between you and lunch. It's been my absolute pleasure to be up on stage with inspirational women. I'm sure we all have some takeaways from this panel. Can you please join me in thanking our panel again?